Good morning, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff Lives 2. And this morning I'm continuing my reading of the book How the Nation Was Won by H. Graham Lowry, published by Executive Intelligence Review about, 15 years ago, if I recall. And it's a great alternate way to look at American history. What Graham Lowry has done is threaded the needle in a way that ties our history together from the Puritans when they uh, decided to create a new world, a new society by leaving the excuse me, by leaving uh, the European system entirely, and to create their own new world, city on the hill, perhaps something that would be a beacon to other people around the world to see, yeah, people can live freely. They can live in a ordered society, a republic where everyone has rights and everyone respects each other's rights, and that therefore there doesn't have to be war or violent solutions anymore. We've got it all covered here in our Commonwealth, the wealth of all of us put together into a small but strong state, a nation, in fact. And based upon its own charter, that was the basic idea of New England, that they were starting their own thing, a new thing. Heidi Hummel, thank you for your kind words. Yeah. Marcia's actually getting ready to go to her cardiac rehab, so that will be good. Hello, David. Hello, all the sun. Corky, Linda, Robert, everybody. So glad to have you all here with me. And once again, um, McDuff, Kennedy's man to smash the CIA, just can't be quashed. You can't stop McDuff. McDuff is going to keep coming at you like that fullback from hell that's always going to be breaking through the line. You're not going to stop him. So that's what we're doing here is we're advancing the ball for McDuff. Because, my dad, he grew up in an Irish American family, but it wasn't really Irish American except in name. In reality, it was a Victorian family, a WASP wannabe family that suppressed its Irish roots. They didn't even talk about it. My dad did not know what town in County Clare or even in Ireland that his ancestors came from. He didn't know. He was starting to research that himself in what little spare time he had. My grandfather didn't know. Why? Because his grandparents didn't tell him. They wanted to start a new world. They wanted to break away from the horrors and tragedies and famine and genocide that their family had experienced in West County Clare and become part of America. And it sounded like a great dream, the American dream. Of course, the reality is that you either become part of the Borg, to use a metaphor from our TV shows, or you become a serf that gets used until they don't need you anymore and kicked aside. That's America that really, that my dad grew up in, a place of dreams, but also the graveyard of dreams. Unless we turn it around, that's what I say. And McDuff's mission is to turn it around, to restore the integrity of our republic. So, Benjamin Franklin, page 373. Just to repeat a bit, from the moment Charles II in 1684 voided the Winthrop Charter, upon which New England's liberty had been built, the preparations for the American Revolution had begun. In New England, the dates were well remembered. when Mather protege Benjamin Franklin, under the pseudonym of Richard Saunders, began publishing Poor Richard's Almanac in 1733, he left a calling card, perhaps unnoticed since his lifetime. On the almanac's final page, Franklin provided a quote catalog of the principal kings and princes in Europe, with the time of their births and ages. Below a bar line at the end of the list, Franklin printed the birth date of quote Poor Richard, an American prince without subjects. Franklin's coded call to rebuild a republic in America may have gone unnoticed by the royal administrators of the colonies, but in 1775, they would painfully observe the withering fire of Massachusetts militiamen on British troops retreating from Concord and Lexington, drawn into a well-laid trap, sprung by Paul Revere's ride on the night of April 18th, the same night as the Andros Rebellion of 1689. Well, let me add that my notes indicate that the ride was April the 19th and April the 20th. So I regard these dates as very significant in that so many things have happened on the famous 420. And then I can go in and list them for you with a number of the recent shooting tragedies, such as um, the um, Oklahoma tragedy and others on April the 19th. That's the focus that I would put on it, April 19th. Hello, ECAT. How are you? WEF thinks popularity for Beyond Meat will rise this winter when there's nothing else to eat. Yeah, right. But this Beyond Meat stuff is a bunch of garbage. Why don't you just eat vegetables? You know, if you don't want to eat meat, eat vegetables. Vegetables, cut out the middleman, the middle cow. You don't need to eat the cow. You can just eat the vegetables. Well, some of us like to eat cow, right? With his Silence Do Good letters, Franklin had entered into active duty in the American Republican Intelligence Service, founded by John Winthrop. Yet, even though Franklin had been imbued from childhood with a vision of a new world by men gathering around his father's hearth, there was an important difference. The Massachusetts Republic they had known existed in Franklin's time largely in memory. Its population and institutions were now corrupted, and the quality of education was a pivotal case in point. As Increase Mather's Harvard of half a century earlier, the power of reason essential to a Republican citizenry was inculcated through instruction, including Plato, Kepler, and Milton. Under the Aristotelian takeover of Harvard, following the revocation of the Massachusetts Charter, classical education was steadily discarded in favor of the dead, mechanistic notions of, quote, enlightened modernists, unquote, such as Descartes, Newton, and Locke. Predictably, Harvard commencements soon became riotous orgies instead of celebrations of intellectual accomplishments. It was therefore no coincidence that Benjamin Franklin's first political broadside was aimed at the corruptors of Harvard's role as the fountain of learning for New England republicanism. Nor was it incidental that Franklin's later organizing objectives in Pennsylvania included the founding of a new college as a major priority. But overcoming this cultural degeneracy under conditions of virtual enemy occupation was obstructed most of all by the population's tolerance of such evil. Ooh, tolerance of evil. Tonight we'll be reading from Rulers of Evil. We'll see how the population tolerates those particular rulers. Good morning, NorCal. How are you, JM? And lovely sheep. Lovely. Franklin himself vented his rage against those who pretended to affirm their loyalty to New England while blithely complying with every atrocity dictated by the British oligarchy. In his ninth Silence Do-Good letter, Franklin evoked ugly memories of Joseph Dudley, the man Cotton Mather had branded our criminal governor, who had ostensibly prepared for the Puritan ministry at Harvard, graduating in 1665. The infamous Dudley then worked to destroy the Massachusetts charter, became Sir Edmund Andros's royal lieutenant governor, and was arrested for treason by Massachusetts during the Andros Rebellion in 1689. In 1702, the quote, pious Dudley was appointed royal governor of New England under the sponsorship of the Duke of Marlborough, whereupon he proceeded to employ pirates to sink Massachusetts' ships and sell arms to the French in Canada for use against New England. Yet he was sustained as governor until his death in 1716, when his passing was lamented by criminals and fools alike, including some ministers who offered him eulogies. Silence Dogood observed, quote, a public hypocrite every day deceives his betters and makes them the ignorant trumpeters of his supposed godliness. They take him for a saint and pass him for one without considering that they are, as it were, the instruments of public mischief out of conscience and ruin their country for God's sake. This political description of a hypocrite may, for aught I know, be taken a new doctrine by some of your readers, but let them consider that a little religion and a little honesty goes a great way in courts. But the most dangerous hypocrite is, in a commonwealth, is one who leaves the gospel for the sake of the law. A man compounded of law and gospel is able to cheat a whole country with his religion and then destroy them under color of law. And here the clergy are in great danger of being deceived, and the people of being deceived by the clergy, until the monster arrives to such power and wealth that he is out of the reach of both and can oppress the people without their own blind assistance. And when he happens to, quote, die for the good of his country, unquote, without leaving behind him the memory of one good action, he shall be sure to have his funeral sermon stuffed with pious expressions, which he dropped at such a time and at such a place and on such an occasion, dot, dot, dot. Well, let's take a second and break that down. A public hypocrite every day deceives his betters and makes them the trumpeters of his supposed godliness. But the most dangerous hypocrite in a commonwealth is one who leaves the gospel for the sake of the law. Isn't that not putting everything into one little nice sentence? One who leaves the gospel for the sake of the law. In other words, somebody who will have started out as a preacher, someone who has the diplomas and trappings of religious authority, but then transfers his loyalty to the law, the cold law, and forgets about the reason that the religious authorities have for their authority, and that is the love of God. And so the project leaves the province of God and enters the province of man, and the imperfections of that man's vision will always cause pain, hardship, death, genocide. These imperfections brought about by a purely mathematical world. That's what when you hear people criticized as being Aristotelian, what they're saying is it's a zero-sum game. They're saying that we believe that one person's gain has to be at the expense of another person's loss. one person's life is at the expense of somebody's death. And the success that you achieve is not due to God or to your character or being a good person at all. Your success is due to your being a very, very clever, lawyerly, but ruthless advocate of your own advancement. Pardon me. Such a state of affairs with the oligarchy on the verge of ruling without the population's quote own blind assistance unquote was the Massachusetts of Franklin's youth and of Cotton Mather's last years. The official institutions established by the Republican forebears had too long been in enemy hands. Cotton Mather had turned to unofficial, voluntarist associations for reawakening the population, as evidenced by his 1710 essays to do good. But his intent was always to reclaim the institutions of power and to remake them in the service of the Republic. Pardon me, a little tickle in my throat. To carry out this complex responsibility, it was necessary to operate successfully under the enemy's noses. Franklin had demonstrated the ability to do just that. Soon, Cotton Mather sent him forth on a much more daring mission, reaching all the way to, quote, Hellfire, London. All right, before we get to Hellfire, London, let me just emphasize what I wonder if you are all are thinking the same thing I am. That is the population's blind assistance is what's permitting this tragedy that's unfolding now all around the world. And the powerful, the oligarchs, the people for whom Klaus Schwab speaks, they have controlled our institutions ever since, well, you name a date. I say from November 22nd, 1963, when they assassinated the president of the United States and took over the government in a coup. That's what I say. And it ever since that time, the enemy has controlled our government. The government set up for, by, for, and of the people has been subverted to the oligarchs working behind the shields of corporate liability and the incredible financial system that sustains itself only because of the blind assistance of the population. And we as a population, oops, look at that. That was almost a sad symbol there to think my flag going upside down. Nope. Gonna keep that guy up there. There you go. All right. Because we have to sustain this flag. We have to sustain our liberty, or will. I mean, these oligarchs, they don't care about us. So that's why I'm reading. Good morning, Papa Coin. Good morning, all Ospreys. Glad you're with us. Raina Jaris. I know I said that wrong. If people are unaware of re-education camps built under the ruse of the cough in Australia and unaware of FEMA's activities, now is a good time to pay attention. Amen. Bribe more. Absolutely. Wake up. You know, Get up, stand up, but most importantly, wake up. Realize that our institutions have been taken over by the enemy. The enemy. The enemy of freedom, the enemy of mankind's individual rights, the enemy of God's creation. The people that want to take this beautiful creation and turn it to their own service, to destroy the beauty of nature in favor of mining rare minerals, driving entire cultures into death just to clear some land for a transportation route, poisoning people just to get them out of the way. That's not God's plan. And, you show me a human that can make a blade of grass. Okay? Just go out there and create a blade of grass for me. And maybe I might give you a little bit of credit for having some godlike properties. But no, the God that created nature is a whole lot more powerful than anything you can ever think of. You know, what was that from the Tempest, right? There are more things in my more things in what is it? More things in the universe than are dreamt of in my laboratory, in my library. All right, back to reading. Benjamin Franklin left Boston in late September 1723, ostensibly because his half-brother James had blacklisted him among Boston sprinters, and because he had made himself, quote, a little obnoxious to the governing party. Cotton Mather's enemies in the Cook machine controlled the legislature. The only surviving account of Franklin's decision is the portion of his autobiography written in 1771 as a letter to his son William, who defected to the British during the Revolution. Franklin's own reluctance to commit sensitive intelligence matters to paper was by no means diminished by the fact that he was writing to his own son. William Franklin had been targeted while in London with his father during the 1760s for recruitment into the networks of the Hellfire Club. Sir Francis Dashwood, His Majesty's Postmaster General at the time, was then Benjamin Franklin's official superior. Franklin directed the postal service for the American colonies. Dashwood was the head of the Hellfire Club. Well, we all know that the person that runs the postal service is often tempted to use that power surreptitiously to gain intelligence useful to himself or his superiors. And one would be naive not to think that Franklin was in that position, especially when you consider its association with Dashwood, the head of the Hellfire Club. Yet the first part of the autobiography, covering Franklin's life to approximately 1730, was also written as a kind of essay to do good for his son. Thus, the pattern of his activities as related is to a definite purpose, even though their particular significance is masked by withholding important details. Only by reading that pattern in the context of precise knowledge of the time can one learn the secrets of the young Benjamin Franklin's role in the battle for the American Republic. When he departed for Philadelphia in 1723, the 17-year-old Franklin was no runaway adventurer. He had already worked as an undercover agent for Cotton Mather against the Boston branch of the Hellfire Club. Now, isn't that interesting? The people that would like to associate Benjamin Franklin with the Hellfire Club are running into this writer who says, no, he was on the other side politically. With Robert Walpole's coming to power, George I's government had by 1723 openly embraced Bernard Mandeville's doctrine that private vices and official corruption were the basis for public benefits. The strategic urgency of building an American republic was now all the greater. Virginia's Governor Spotswood, with Pennsylvania's Keith and New York's Hunter and Burnett, had opened the door with the 1722 Treaty of Albany with the Iroquois. That agreement had removed the main threat to settling Virginia's Shenandoah Valley beyond the Blue Ridge and confirmed its route to the west along the Potomac River deep into the Allegheny Mountains. The potential also existed to extend Pennsylvania's settlements into the Alleghenies and to funnel waves of pioneers into the Shenandoah Valley, stretching toward Kentucky and Tennessee. America's Republican command, however, was now weakened. Walpole had forced Spotswood's removal from office in 1722, and New York's Governor Burnett was unequal to the leadership of his predecessor, Robert Hunter, the Republican colleague of Swift and of Mather. In Philadelphia, Governor Keith remained in office, but was under siege by the Quakers' moneyed men. Yet Pennsylvania was the keystone for building colonies beyond the mountains. It was no accident that Benjamin Franklin, Cotton Mather's most gifted protege, was deployed there. Consider the chain of events which Franklin reports masked as mere happenstances. His departure from Boston was arranged in secrecy, for passage on a ship bound for New York under a cover story established by his closest intellectual companion, whom he had known since childhood. The two had, quote, read the same books together, and while Franklin lived in Boston, most of my hours of leisure for conversation were spent with him, and he continued a sober and industrious lad, and was much respected for his learning by several of the clergy and other gentlemen. Upon arrival in New York, Franklin presented himself as a young printer in search of work to William Bradford, the publisher of Robert Hunter's satirical play, Androboros. Bradford forwarded him to his son Andrew, a printer in Philadelphia, telling Franklin, if you go thither, I believe he may employ you. By a series of boat trips and a 50-mile hike through New Jersey to the Delaware River, Franklin proceeded to Philadelphia in a most inconspicuous fashion, where upon arrival he made certain he would be observed. In work clothes dirtied by his long journey, he joined a procession of many clean-dressed people entering the great meeting house of the Quakers near the market. There he sat down among them, and after looking round a while and hearing nothing, said, I fell fast asleep, and continued so till the meeting broke up, when someone was kind enough to rouse me. The next morning, dressed as neat as I could, he went to the print shop of Andrew Bradford, where Franklin found the old man his father, whom I had seen in New York, and who, traveling on horseback, had got to Philadelphia before me. Without directly making the point, Franklin here provides the evidence that William Bradford, a member of the circles of Swift, Hunter, and Mather, personally oversaw establishing Franklin's initial cover in Philadelphia. Andrew Bradford offered Franklin the hospitality of his home until a less obvious place of employment could be arranged. William Bradford then conducted Franklin to another printer in town lately set up, one Keimer, that's Keimer, who intended to challenge the younger Bradford for the business in Philadelphia. To the newcomer Keimer, the old gentleman Bradford pretended to be a local dignitary. Neighbor, said Bradford, I have brought to see you a young man of your business. Perhaps you may want such a one. And taking old Bradford, whom he had never seen before, to be one of the townspeople that had a good will for him, Keimer entered into a conversation on his present undertakings. Even though Franklin told Keimer who the old man was, he was soon hired. He began spending his evenings among the young people of the town that were lovers of reading. He reported his new station to Boston, but only through the friend who had arranged his departure, quote, who was in my secret and kept it when I wrote to him. Soon after Franklin was established in Philadelphia, word of the arrangement was passed to Governor William Keith by Franklin's brother-in-law, Robert Holmes, master of a sloop that traded between Boston and Delaware. It was not long before Keith appeared finely dressed at Keimer's door to request a meeting with Benjamin Franklin, the promising young man he had recently heard of, who should be encouraged. The governor ignored Keimer, and with the condescension and politeness I had been quite unused to, made me many compliments. I was not a little surprised, and Keimer stared like a pig poisoned. At the tavern, Keith told Franklin that he wanted him to become the public printer for Pennsylvania. Certainly an unusual offer for a supposed young vagabond from Boston. Keith then suggested that Franklin's father, a longtime organizer for Cotton Mather, might provide him the money to set up his own print shop. On my doubting whether my father would assist me in it, Sir William said he would set forth the advantages, and he did not doubt he should determine to comply. In the meantime, the intention was to be kept secret, and I went on working with Keimer as usual. The autobiography reports that Franklin's father refused to finance a new printing business for his son, being in his opinion too young to be trusted with the management of an undertaking so important. But he was pleased that Benjamin had so impressed a person of such note as the governor of Pennsylvania. But here the account makes a crucial omission of enormous significance for deciphering the document. No mention is made of the fact that on this return to Boston, Franklin met privately with Cotton Mather. 60 years later, after Britain had conceded the sovereignty of the United States in the Treaty of Paris, Franklin wrote from France to Cotton's son Samuel Mather, quote, "The last time I saw your father was in the beginning of 1724 when I visited him after my first trip to Pennsylvania." The letter again paid tribute to Cotton Mather's determining influence on his life. Franklin returned to Philadelphia, making the first leg of the journey by sloop to New York. There he made contact with Robert Hunter's hand-picked successor, the then governor of New York, Burnet, son of Bishop Burnet. Hearing from the captain that a young man, one of his passengers, had a great many books, desired him to bring me to see him. The governor received me with great civility, showed me his library, which was a very considerable one, and we had a good deal of conversation about books and authors. Next, Governor Keith arranged for a mission to London for the, quote, poor boy, ostensibly to purchase new type and printing equipment. Keith told Franklin, "Then, when there, you may make acquaintances and establish correspondences in the bookselling and stationery way." In considerable detail, the autobiography reports Franklin's arrangements with Keith for the voyage. He was to sail in late October on the Annis, the annual ship from Philadelphia to England. Keith was to furnish him with recommendations to a number of his friends, as well as a letter of credit for the printing machines. During the month awaiting his passage, Franklin reports, Governor Keith had me frequently to his house. Much is made of Keith's repeated postponements in delivering the promised letters to Franklin, of his sailing from Philadelphia without them, expecting Keith to intercept the ship at Newcastle, and of arriving in England to discover Keith had supplied no letters at all. There, Franklin made a great show of being a poor, ignorant boy whose trusting nature had been betrayed by the Pennsylvania governor. From the higher level of evidence, it is clear that this episode with Keith was simply a part of Franklin's cover story for a secret intelligence mission. Consider again the pattern of his accounts in the autobiography, juxtaposed against this provable course of his activities. Franklin's career in political combat begins with his anonymous Silence Dogood letters, supposedly written to impress the Hellfire Club circle controlling his half-brother James, but in fact undertaken as an undercover operation in support of Cotton Mather. He flees Boston in secret, purportedly fearing reprisals from his brother's enemies. Yet, on his return, is welcomed into Mather's home, Robert Hunter's friend, the New York printer William Bradford, arranges Franklin's first employment in Philadelphia, but sends him on an arduous overland and riverboat journey to get there, instead of letting Franklin accompany him on horseback. Perhaps no one took notice of Franklin's meeting with New York's Governor Burnet, but Keith's patronage could hardly be overlooked. Governor Keith, after all, was the known ally of Robert Hunter and Alexander Spotswood. Franklin's own safety, as well as any prospects for a successful undercover mission in Britain, thus depended upon his having no apparent ties to Keith or to Cotton Mather. Franklin's autobiography, written nearly a half century later, still preserves his cover, yet provides clues. He deliberately obscures his personal connection to Mather while praising his essays to do good. Keith's relationship is portrayed as duplicitous, but Franklin concludes that account by declaring that Keith was otherwise an ingenious, sensible man, a pretty good writer, and a good governor for the people. Several of our best laws were of his planning and passed during his administration. Unquote. The young Franklin, to the extent his actual connections could be hidden, was an ideal agent for a counterintelligence mission against Robert Walpole's Hellfire regime in London. The appearance of hostility to Keith was especially important, for the scrutiny of Walpole's agents had already been attracted by another American's arrival in 1724, Alexander Spotswood. The man who would later appoint Franklin postmaster of Philadelphia had returned to London ostensibly to reconfirm his land titles in Spotsylvania County, Virginia. Franklin arrived in London on Christmas Eve, 1724. Two things are certain. Whether Keith had furnished him with any letters or not, someone had paid his passage. Second, Franklin had not come to London simply to work in printing houses for more than a year and a half. Hellfire London. Coordinating a Republican movement in the American colonies had always been hampered by the difficulty of obtaining adequate intelligence concerning machinations in London. Now the problem was even greater, since the blowout of the South Sea bubble and the restructuring of power under the parliamentary regime of Robert Walpole and his stock jobbers, Britain's political map had been drastically redrawn. London was fast becoming, quote, Venice on the Thames, and was threatening to supersede Sodom and Gomorrah. For a glimpse of how far London soon descended into this inferno, one need only study the engravings of Swift's ally, the artist William Hogarth. Culturally and thus politically, the nature of the beast had changed. Following George I's taking the throne in 1714 and the publication of Bernard Mandeville's The Fable of the Bees that same year, satanic cults proliferated among Britain's elite. Okay, let's stop and do a little speed bump here. Satanic cults proliferated among Britain's elite. Where else do we have satanic cults? Oh, you mean like LaVey and Aquino and crazy religious crap that we're looking at now, seducing people into becoming virtual Hellfire Club members themselves. Yeah. Hi, David. David Underdown's here. Great. Tavistock. Exactly. Nothing new under the sun. Just like the whole debate about vaccines. 300 years ago, the same debate going on, 1721 Boston. Smallpox. To vax or not to vax? Oops, I just said vax. Oops. Hope I don't get struck down by YouTube. Isn't it ridiculous? Isn't it just ridiculous? Look, that's why I started Screaming Ospreys TV, because I'm working on a way that they can't stop us. We'll be able to post things anonymously that they won't be able to stop. So stay tuned. I'll I'll tell you more about it, but it's an opportunity for us to bypass the censors. The most notorious were the various branches of the Hellfire Club, modeled after Mandeville's doctrine that evil, vice, and corruption were the ideal means of the state's controlling its servants. Oh boy. Doesn't this sound just exactly, you know, evil, vice, and corruption were the ideal means of control of the state controlling its servants, or the drones of the hive? I mean, that's Malthusianism right there, saying, it's pain and pleasure. We will rule by enforcing pain and pleasure upon the serfs, depending upon whether they do what we want or not. But now we have people like John Podesta, seducing people into the satanic world with his silly memes. Mandeville's bestial notions were later celebrated by such hedonistic philosophers as Voltaire, Helvetius, Helvetius, which means from Switzerland, by the way, Montesquieu, James Mill, and Jeremy Bentham. In 1720, the year of the bubble and an unrestrained Venetian rampage against Britain, the Hellfire Clubs played a major part in the intended shock treatment. The most prominent one was founded that year by the new Lord Wharton, later elevated to Duke. The club's dining menu included, quote, Hellfire Punch, Holy Ghost Pie, Devil's Loins, and, Breast of Venus, garnished with cherries for nipples. Even in London, such open Satan worshipping was a bit ahead of its time, and in 1721 a king's order in council was issued banning the Hellfire Clubs, at least in such public forms. But the satanic notion that there is no distinction between good and evil continued to rule government policy and was promulgated quite directly by George I's chief minister, Robert Walpole. Increase Mather was entirely accurate when in 1722 he charged James Franklin with promoting a Hellfire Club in Boston for publishing the claim that man cannot distinguish between the work of God and the work of the devil. When Benjamin Franklin arrived in London, a most vital intelligence task would have been to dissect this new form of the beast, the politically powerful networks of the Hellfire Club. Well, we will learn more about the Hellfire Club when we do our next reading from How the Nation Was Won. In the chapter Who Was Benjamin Franklin? We have reached page 393 of the book, and we will leave the rest to the next time. So thanks for being with me. I'm sure that you will stick around for a neighborhood news hour at noon. So I'll see you over there. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being with me.
but let's just
John on right now? Is this John's broadcast?